I am Adrian Tripod, the director of this place, the House of Skin.
This is a video essay about the 1970 David Cronenberg film Crimes of the Future, which I first saw in 2016. Now, I first discovered David Cronenberg in 1984 when I'd been allowed to stay up late for my birthday to watch a film, and that film was The Dead Zone. And boy, howdy did I ever love it. That crisp Maine air, which was actually Canada, the soulful sadness of Christopher Walken's face, that ending, it was a hell of a thing. But for a few years, that was as far as I got with Cronenberg. And then, in 1987, The Fly was pretty much the only film that anyone talked about for a while.
I've come here to say one magic word to you.
Yeah?
Cheeseburger.
And this was my reintroduction to the fact that Cronenberg existed. I didn't actually see it until 1988 at a friend's house with his sister, but what a trip. However, again, I went no further into Casa del Cronenberg. And then, in 1989, for Christmas, I received a copy of Jeff Andrews' The Film Handbook, a kind of A to Z of filmmakers with a brief run-through of all the films they've made. And this is where I learned about all the other films Cronenberg had made, and I was able to piece together a map of sorts. Let's all remember that this was a world that did not have IMDb, no internet. You couldn't just type the name David Cronenberg into a computer and find out everything about him. You had TV, books, magazines, and talking to people, and that was pretty much it. And if I hadn't got that Jeff Andrew book, it might have taken me even longer to learn what Cronenberg's back catalogue was. So following this, I sought out all the other films Cronenberg had made, and I watched Rabid, Shivers, The Brood, Scanners, Videodrome, rewatched The Dead Zone, and it was all pretty great. But something was bugging me. You see, in Jeff Andrews' book, he talked about two of Cronenberg's early films, Stereo and Crimes of the Future, which I did not seem to be able to find anywhere. You couldn't get them on video, they weren't on TV, they weren't at the cinema. And then, 3 years later, in 1992, I found a £20 note on the street, and I took it straight to a bookshop and bought myself a copy of a then brand new book, Cronenberg on Cronenberg. Look, amazingly, I still have my copy of that book. Been through a lot since then. Now, Cronenberg on Cronenberg went into a lot more detail about not only Stereo and Crimes of the Future, but also two other films I hadn't heard of at all by this point, From the Drain and Transfer. There were also pictures from the films, actual black and white still images of films I've been thinking about and wanting to see for 3 years. Man, oh Malle. And yet, despite all this information, I still had to wait another 24 years before I would be able to see any of these films. Because in 2015, Arrow Video released Videodrome on Blu-ray, and they included a bonus disc of remastered copies of all of Cronenberg's early films, a fact which completely passed me by at the time, until 1 year later, in 2016, when Arrow released all of these films separately, available for the first time ever, as far as I knew. So, what was it like to hear about a film all the way back in 1989, but not get to see it till 2016? First, let's talk about the old days. See, back in the days of yore, there were only a handful of filmmakers who were considered great filmmakers. They included Ingmar Bergman, Jean-Luc Godard, Federico Fellini, Michelangelo Antonioni, Robert Bresson, Louis Buñuel, and Andrei Tarkovsky. Are there other names? Sure, 100%. But these people were widely considered the giants of their time. Why were these people so celebrated? Because they created their own worlds, which were very identifiable, very much a part of who they were. There's no way you can watch a Tarkovsky film and think you're watching a Bergman film, and vice versa. Their styles were like fingerprints, unique. They also, largely, made films as art, not entertainment, and stuck to their guns, and only made films they wanted to make, for the most part. These 7 men had a big old impact on younger wannabe filmmakers, and if you wanted to be a filmmaker and be taken seriously, you were most likely going to emulate one of these filmmakers. And if you weren't going to emulate their style, then you emulated the concept of having your own voice, or recognizable filmmaking style. You know, you being you, but with film. At the same time, if you were a young wannabe filmmaker, you probably didn't have much money or equipment or resources or access to a wide variety of locations, and if that were the case, then it would be in your interest to do something different that you didn't need a big budget for. Essentially, you're combining the idea of having a voice or style with the fact that you don't have much money, and you're turning this lack of budget into not only a stylistic choice, but also a benefit. Take your weaknesses and make them your strengths. Case in point, look at the George Lucas short film Freiheit, or the Martin Scorsese short film The Big Shave, or the Lars von Trier short film Nocturne. These films were achievable for the young filmmakers to make. A man running in a field, a man shaving in a bathroom, a woman unable to sleep. They didn't need big budgets, or complicated special effects, or elaborate locations. Although, sure, Nocturne does have that. that wicked dramatic opening. These films also all reject the idea of being entertaining or having a recognizable genre in favor of being art which has something to say, even if that something to say might be a little bit difficult to spot. Fun side note, the main character in Freiheit is played by the director of Grease. True fact. Sometimes you've got people sticking to their guns, working with a minimal budget, but going bigger, like Jim Henson with his 1965 film Timepiece, which is achievable, but also mighty, mighty ambitious, combining live action with archive footage, model photography, stop frame animation, and a huge number of locations. And sure, it's fun, but again, Henson isn't going for traditional storytelling here, or a clear genre. He's just doing what he wants to do. And I don't know about you, but people doing what they want to do really speaks to me. Remember when Beck signed a non-exclusive deal with Geffen Records, which meant he could keep recording and releasing weird little albums like Stereo Pathetic Soul Manure, One Foot in the Grave, and A Western Harvest Field by Moonlight? Like those kind of choices. And then there was that time I went to see the Anthony McCall and Andrew Tyndall 1978 film Argument. Now I can say fairly confidently that you have never seen or even heard about this film. That is okay, because neither had I at the time. I saw it at a screening at the Royal Academy of Art in 2008, where it was showing with two other films, the titles of which I have totally forgotten because I really only had eyes for Argument.
The film viewer acts as a mediator between the problem of creating meaning in film and the problem of understanding meaning in film.
Argument is a film which dissects one single issue of the New York Times through the use of voiceover and images. The film talks about the film you're watching. The film talks about being male. The film talks about fashion photography. The film talks about the wider world. The film talks about the place in the world of the avant-garde artist.
You know how apathetic people are. Just look at you. You complain enough, but you never spend the time and energy trying to organize yourself and the other workers here. We are each of us more interested in our artwork. You know as well as I do that there isn't enough money for us to work full-time as artists. We both have to have outside jobs.
Argument was made in an era when the avant-garde had something to say and were really striving to make the world a better place by questioning things we live with but don't think about. And this is important. Someone has to care about these things. Remember that time Godard and Truffaut crashed the Cannes Film Festival calling for it to be cancelled in the light of what went on in May 1968? We can all hate on Godard for being pretentious, but that was a real baller moment.
Vous parle solidarité avec les étudiants et les ouvriers et vous me parlez travelling et gros plans. Vous êtes
I absolutely loved Argument. I had never seen anything like it, and I haven't really seen anything like it since. After seeing Argument, I was so fired up that I left, walked around for a while, and eventually decided to make my own short film. Would I have done that if I hadn't seen Argument? Maybe, but I'm not sure. Sometimes these things are like dominoes. One falls into another, into another, into another, and it's difficult to tell where things really begin. In the 1960s, director Tony Richardson created his own village in the hills of Saint-Tropez, and he called it Le Nid des Ducs. By the 1970s, Tony's eldest daughter, Natasha Richardson, at the ripe old age of 17, was running Le Nid des Ducs every summer, cooking 3 square meals a day for a floating entourage of approximately 30 people who would come and go and just have a really great summer. Tony Richardson, in his memoirs, remarked at how astonished he was to see Natasha completely unfazed by the news that there would be an additional 20 people on top of the existing 30 to lunch one day. In 1985, Natasha Richardson took part in Actor Aid, an improv event created by Andy Harmon to raise money for the Live Aid cause. One thing falls into another, into another, into another. People going their own way and doing their own thing, creating something out of nothing, creating something that no one asked for but which needed to exist, fires me up like little else does. No one asked Maya Deren to make Meshes of the Afternoon, she just did. No one asked Chris Marker to make La Jetée, he just did. And the world needs people like this. And no one asked for Cronenberg's early films either. He just made them because he needed to. So, 2016, what was it like to finally see Crimes of the Future after all those years of thinking about it? Well, it was a hell of a thing. Also, I can't really talk about Crimes of the Future and not mention Stereo, because Crimes very much is a sequel of sorts to Stereo, not in terms of story, but in terms of vibe. So, just so you know, I'm going to use footage from both films, and if you see black and white, that's Stereo, and if you see colour, that's Crimes of the Future. Both films are deeply avant-garde and transgressive. There are moments and ideas in these two films that arguably arguably go further than anything Cronenberg did for the mainstream. They both concern scientific institutions focusing on some kind of body element. In Stereo, it's the Canadian Academy of Erotic Inquiry, and in Crimes, it's a dermatology company called the House of Skin. Stereo is about a telepathy experiment where psychic powers can be enhanced by, let's call it coupling. But there's also this idea of polyamorous groups replacing the family unit and the creation of new states of consciousness and new personalities. It's all big stuff. Crimes of the Future is more straightforward in a way. It's about a plague caused by makeup, which has wiped out the global population of post-puberty women. It's about men living in a world without women and becoming more female in the process. Both films are also unapologetically academic. Each sentence is dense, layered. The stories are difficult to follow. Stereo is presented as academic findings. Crimes of the Future is more what you might expect as a film, but it's still not necessarily a film. There are long stretches with no music and no voiceover and no sound at all, so it's easy to drift away at times and get lost in your thoughts. Whenever this happens for me, I invariably drift across to wondering what these spaces are, where they are, whether they still exist. And the big one, who are all these people? Where are they now? What have their lives been like in the 50 plus years since this film was made? To get the money to make Stereo, Cronenberg pretended he was going to write a book, but the book was nothing but a ruse, and he instead poured all of the money into Stereo. Remember when Herzog couldn't get a camera to film Aguirre, The Wrath of God, so he just stole a camera and made the film anyway? This is what filmmaking requires sometimes, not just bending the rules, but breaking the rules into pieces. There's a Godard quote that I think about quite a lot with filmmaking. He who jumps into the void owes no explanation to those who stand and watch. And making a film, particularly for the first time, really can feel like that. Stereo gave Cronenberg enough notoriety to raise actual cash money for Crimes of the Future. Imagine that. Imagine making up a super abstract sci-fi feature like this and it being enough of a success that you can get enough money to do it again, but bigger. Stereo had a budget of approximately 3,500 Canadian dollars. Crimes, approximately 15,000 Canadian dollars. Worth mentioning is that Cronenberg had absolutely zero crew for these two films. Have you ever seen a film before that was literally just made by one person? Hell no, of course you haven't. And, like I was saying earlier, these are achievable films. They're shot at the University of Toronto, Massey College and the University of Toronto Scarborough facilities, filmed during the summer break, so the buildings were completely empty, and their style is very much generated by the architecture of these buildings. Nothing new had to be created, pretty much no lights had to be set up. Both films are largely just shot with the existing practical lights and daylight. Neither film uses live sound either, which makes things much easier. You can make as much noise as you like and just add all the voiceover later. But then there are elements to the two films which show Cronenberg is pushing himself, going beyond what is easily achievable. First of all, the two films are shot on 35 goddamn millimeter, which is astonishing. Most people would have created these films on 16mm to save money and make everything just a little bit easier for themselves. But Cronenberg decided to jump in the deep end and shoot with an Arrowflex he got from a Canadian organisation called Filmhouse. As it happens, that decision caused him to be in debt to Filmhouse for 15 years, but you know, that's also filmmaking. Secondly, sure, the films are shot in empty university buildings over the summer, but look at how Stereo opens with a goddamn helicopter landing. Imagine making your first film all by yourself and choosing to organise this. Thirdly, although there's no sync sound for Crimes of the Future, Cronenberg decided, himself, to create an additional audio track of sea creatures. He was thinking of it as the soundtrack to Darwin's Voyage on the Beagle. Did he have to do this? No, but that's what doing things as well as you can is all about. And what about that idea of voice? Can we see anything in Cronenberg's first two films that gives us a clue about what he would go on to do and what kind of a filmmaker he would go on to become? I would argue that when you look at these people in these spaces, pretty easy to see the parallels to his later films. For one reason or another, I get this very strongly with Scanners. The institutional setting, the 60s, 70s Canadian architecture, one thing falls into another, into another, into another. And then there's his names. For those who might not know, Cronenberg has a habit of using weird names for his characters, like the way Thomas Pynchon does. In Stereo and Crimes of the Future, we get Luther Stringfellow, Anton Rouge, and Adrian Tripod. In his later films, we get Darryl Revok, Seth Brundle, Max Wren, Hal Raglan, Brian Oblivion, Barry Convex, Cameron Vale, Nicky Brand, Stathis Barans, Ted Keipel, Beverly Mantle, Nola Carveth, Kim Obreist, Karsh Relic, Rollo Linsky, Jan Hartog, Yevgeny Naresh, Murray Cypher, Darcy Nader, Bianca Oblivion, and the demoness Allegra Geller, to name just a few.
Death to the Demoness Allegra Geller.
Earlier, I mentioned the Magnificent Seven filmmakers, and it's worth mentioning that Cronenberg didn't take any influence from them at all, or any other filmmaker. As a writer, he felt that he was slave to recreating the works of Nabokov and Burroughs every time he picked up a pen, but as a filmmaker, he felt free and unfettered and uninfluenced by any pre-existing film or filmmaker. But there was pivotal influence on both Crimes of the Future and Stereo, and that influence was Ronald Mlozek. Mlozek was a student at Massey College and plays the lead role in both films. Mlozek had what Cronenberg described as a medieval personality, and it's the performance of Ron Mlozek and his sensibilities, way of gesturing and moving through a space that very much sets the tone for both films. Ron Mlozek had a small speaking role in Cronenberg's first commercial feature, Shivers, and I often find myself wondering what happened to him after that, because apart from small appearances in 2 Canadian TV movies and a blink and you miss it appearance in Rabid, he really does just disappear from cinema history after this.
Hey boys, let's take her right into pre-op. Dr. Carl set her up for the works.
What's that all about?
Somebody said something about an accident.
You think they could cover it with a sheet or something?
So yeah, that's Crimes of the Future, and I do appreciate that it might be a difficult watch, but goddamn do I ever love what it stands for. It is simultaneously a celebration of and a sad lament for the world of filmmaking that we don't have anymore. Remember when budding filmmakers would make something decidedly them and decidedly uncommercial when they were starting out, and the world around them would then look at these things and decide that they might be able to achieve great things with a budget? Somewhere along the way, we lost the idea of being different, of doing something unexpected, of doing something that has real sharp teeth. Love it or hate it, the recent Skinamarink is very much something different and unexpected, and watching a $12,000 film in an actual real cinema was a pretty great experience. So, you know, this kind of thing gives me hope for the future. Part of me would really love someone like Steven Spielberg to redress the balance, get a 16mm camera, a handful of great actors, and go to a weird place, make a film on location with an absolute shoestring budget, set the bar, dare others to try and achieve the same. Steven, if you're watching, do it. Get people to fall in love with the basic building blocks of cinema again, and get Ron Mlozek on board.
His body, he insists, is a galaxy. And these creatures are solar systems.